like to think. I'd like to think I'm a good mum, a good wife. I try to be the best that I can.
It happened in plain sight. Not in a courtroom, not in a tabloid leak. It happened live. When Victoria Beckham appeared on a televised segment and appeared to allude to a missing couture dress once loaned under strict conditions, viewers sensed the shift immediately. The language was careful. The implication was not. Within hours, speculation ignited around Meghan Markle. A dress valued at $10,000 and a private disagreement was suddenly reframed as a public confrontation. No accusation was formally made. No evidence was presented. But the suggestion alone was enough to fracture alliances, divide opinion, and force an uncomfortable question. What happens when fashion, fame, and royalty collide on live television? Tonight, we trace how the moment unfolded, why it escalated so quickly, and how the implications reshaped a relationship long rumored to be tense. The comment landed in real time under studio lights with no chance to edit or clarify. During a live television segment, Victoria Beckham was asked about the pressures of lending couture pieces to high-profile figures. Her answer was measured until it wasn't. She described a dress loaned under strict conditions, a price point she emphasized as $10,000, and a return that never happened. She did not name anyone. She did not need to.
The product, making sure that I don't put anything out there, whether it's a simple piece of clothing or an eyeliner, until I truly believe.
Within minutes, producers knew what viewers would do with it. The phrasing was careful, but the implication was sharp. Beckham spoke about the rules of her industry, about trust, about how couture loans are tracked with receipts, fittings, and signed agreements. Then she paused and added a line that changed the temperature in the room. Sometimes, she said, people believe status exempts them from those rules. The camera cut to the host. Social media lit up. Editors replayed the clip frame by frame. The audience reaction was instant because the context already existed. Beckham's long-rumored frostiness toward Meghan Markle had been fodder for columns years earlier, usually dismissed as gossip. This was different. It was live. It was specific, and it carried a price tag. Fashion insiders immediately explained the mechanics. A couture loan is not a gift. Dresses are cataloged, insured, fitted, and signed out. A missing piece is not a misunderstanding. It is an accounting problem. That explanation reframed the moment from celebrity shade to industry grievance. The story moved from entertainment to reputation. Inside media newsrooms, a debate broke out. Was this a direct accusation? No. Was it a pointed insinuation? Absolutely. An insinuation, especially when paired with numbers and process, travels faster than proof. Editors chose their verbs carefully. Alluded, suggested, implied. The effect was the same.
Now, then, that's the right way. I might not have had the courage to do it, but there was a naivety that had a sense of freedom.
By the end of the hour, Meghan's name was trending alongside Beckham's clip. Commentators stressed that no allegation had been formally made. Others argued that live television removes deniability by design. If Beckham wanted to keep it private, she would not have said it on air. The stakes escalated because silence would now be interpreted. Behind the scenes, fashion editors began calling sources. Was there a dress? Was there a loan? Was there paperwork? No. One would confirm specifics on the record. Privately, several insiders said the rules are strict precisely to avoid such disputes. When address disappears, the house notices. When the borrower is famous, the problem becomes political. The antagonist structure formed quickly. On one side stood a designer defending industry norms. On the other stood a public figure protected by aura and status. Between them sat institutions that wanted no part of a fashion fight becoming a royal problem. That included Buckingham Palace.
Because if we kind of look back on the year and how she's been trying to push this brand, the rebrand, and she continues to, of course, flaunt her royal titles.
Royal correspondents reported that palace aides were alerted within hours. The initial assessment was blunt. This was not an institutional matter. No state event, no official engagement, no palace wardrobe. The instruction was distant. Do not engage.
Do not clarify. Do not amplify.
That decision immediately split opinion. One camp argued that silence was correct. Fashion disputes are private, and the palace should not arbitrate celebrity grievances. The other camp worried that silence would be read as avoidance, especially given the insinuation's public nature. Once a story goes live, refusing to acknowledge it can be seen as tacit acceptance. Meanwhile, the human drama sharpened. Meghan appeared at a previously scheduled appearance the following day. Cameras lingered. Commentators dissected her outfit choice, tone, and posture. None of it proved anything. All of it fed the narrative that something was wrong. David Beckham's absence from the conversation was noted. Analysts asked whether the Beckhams were unified in the decision to let the comment stand. Fashion insiders suggested that Victoria Beckham would not casually discuss a missing couture piece on live television without confidence in her ground. Others argued that frustration can override caution when private channels fail. Online, the clip multiplied. Each repost added a new caption. Some framed it as theft, others as entitlement, others as misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The truth mattered less than the image. A $10,000 dress, a designer's rules, a duchess's silence. The stakes escalated again when entertainment panels invited fashion lawyers. They explained that couture houses document loans meticulously to protect both parties. A missing item triggers internal escalation long before it becomes public. That explanation implied a backstory without confirming one. The palace maintained its distance. No statement, no background briefing. The choice reinforced the idea that this was a social dispute, not a constitutional one. Yet the monarchy's silence also left the field open for celebrity media to define the narrative. By evening, headlines softened their language, but hardened their framing. Victoria Beckham appears to accuse. Meghan linked to missing couture. Each headline walked the line between caution and provocation. None resolved the question at the center of the storm. What made the moment volatile was not the claim itself, but where it happened. Live television collapses context. It forces interpretation. Now, Beckham's words could be defended as general. They could also be read as specific. Once aired, they belonged to the audience. And the audience had decided this was not just about fashion. It was about boundaries, about whether status bends rules, about who gets held to account when disputes cross from private to public. The fuse had been lit. No receipts had been shown. No names had been spoken. Yet the damage was already measurable in tone, in silence, and in the speed with which a single remark became a referendum on trust. By the following morning, the dispute had slipped out of the fashion pages and into a wider cultural argument about power and privilege. Editors were no longer debating whether Victoria Beckham had intended to single out Meghan Markle. They were debating why the remark had landed so cleanly and why it had not been diffused.
To a room at a private New York City townhouse, a staffer had to announce her as Meghan, Duchess of Sussex.
Inside Buckingham Palace, the assessment was swift and procedural. This was not an official wardrobe matter. No palace stylist had been involved. No state event was referenced. The guidance was clear. Remain disengaged. Palace aides briefed correspondents that social or commercial disputes fall outside institutional responsibility. That decision created two factions almost immediately. One group of advisors argued that distance was essential. Entering a fashion dispute, they warned, would collapse the boundary between private life and constitutional duty. The monarchy cannot be seen to arbitrate celebrity grievances, particularly those aired on commercial television. The opposing group worried about optics. Silence, they argued, would be read as discomfort, especially when the allegation carried a clear moral charge. The palace chose restraint. That vacuum shifted the pressure back onto celebrity media. Panels filled with airtime parsing etiquette rather than evidence. Fashion insiders explained that couture loans operate on trust reinforced by contracts and insurance. When a piece does not return, the house absorbs risk. Until it does. That explanation framed the issue as systemic rather than personal. Yet, the personalization was unavoidable because of the names involved. The Beckhams' long-standing proximity to royal life sharpened the story. Analysts noted their presence at high-profile royal events and charity initiatives. That history lent Victoria Beckham's words an air of credibility in the public imagination. If she spoke, viewers assumed she knew the rules of proximity and protocol.
And fighting those preconceptions for nearly 2 decades.
David Beckham's silence became a subplot. Commentators speculated whether the couple had agreed to let the remarks stand without clarification. Some suggested the decision reflected exhaustion after failed private attempts to resolve the issue. Others argued it was a calculated move, allowing implication to do what accusation could not. Meanwhile, Meghan's public schedule continued. Cameras tracked her movements with heightened intensity. Commentators dissected her wardrobe choices, searching for signals that were not there. Supporters argued this scrutiny was punitive, a pylon driven by misogyny and celebrity appetite. Critics countered that high-profile figures are judged by how they respond under pressure, and silence invites interpretation. The human drama deepened as friends and associates were drawn into commentary. Anonymous sources described tension and hurt feelings. None of it was verified. Much of it conflicted. Yet, repetition gave the impression of a narrative unfolding behind closed doors. Editors acknowledged privately that the absence of a record rebuttal allowed speculation to harden. Fashion lawyers added another layer. They explained that couture houses rarely go public about missing items because doing so damages both parties. When disputes surface publicly, it often means private channels have stalled. That explanation implied escalation without confirming specifics, fueling the sense that something unresolved existed. Online, the story mutated rapidly. Some framed it as theft, others as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, others as a clash of cultures between fashion industry discipline and royal aura. None of these frames required proof to circulate. They required only repetition and a compelling image, a $10,000 dress, a designer's rules, a duchess's silence. The antagonist structure was now unmistakable. On one side stood a designer defending industry norms and personal boundaries. On the other stood a figure shielded by status and institutional distance. Between them stood the palace refusing to arbitrate and the media unwilling to let the issue fade. By evening, the language of coverage shifted again. Remark became row. Row became rift. Each shift escalated the stakes without adding facts. Editors admitted that the story's endurance depended less on evidence than on the unresolved tension between public implication and private silence. Inside palace circles, advisors acknowledged the risk of reputational bleed. Even if the story cooled, it would linger as context, resurfacing whenever discussions of celebrity entitlement or royal privilege arose. That lingering effect was familiar. Unresolved implication rarely disappears. It waits. The decision to stay silent held. No statement emerged from royal channels. No clarification from fashion houses appeared on the record. The Beckhams did not walk back the comment. Meghan did not address it. What remained was an imbalance. One side had spoken live and publicly. The other had not. In a media environment driven by implication, that imbalance carries weight. It does not prove anything. It shapes perception. As the second day closed, the story had moved beyond the dress itself. It had become a referendum on boundaries. Who follows rules? Who enforces them? And who is expected to answer when disputes cross from private to public? Without receipts or resolution, the fallout continued to spread, powered by silence as much as speech. By the third day, the story no longer belonged to the original moment on live television. It belonged to the silence that followed. What Victoria Beckham had said carefully and without names mattered less than what neither side chose to clarify afterward. In celebrity disputes, resolution often comes through receipts or retraction. Here, there was neither. Editors noticed the shift immediately. Coverage shifted away from whether a dress had actually gone missing and toward the broader issue of credibility. Fashion insiders spoke about norms, not specifics. Royal correspondents spoke about boundaries, not facts. The absence of detail created a vacuum, and that vacuum filled quickly with interpretation. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors acknowledged that the story had escaped its original category. It was no longer a fashion anecdote. It was a reputational event with royal adjacency. The palace maintained its position that this was a private commercial matter, not an institutional one. Yet advisors also recognized that institutional distance carries a cost when the public perceives an imbalance. Two camps remained entrenched. One faction insisted the palace was right to stay out. Intervening in a designer dispute would set a precedent that would be impossible to contain. The monarchy, they argued, cannot be drawn into adjudicating celebrity disagreements. Aired on commercial television. The opposing faction worried that the refusal to engage allowed a narrative of entitlement to calcify. When one side speaks publicly and the other remains silent, audiences tend to assume asymmetry of power. That asymmetry framed coverage of Meghan Markle. Commentators were careful to repeat that no accusation had been formally made. At the same time, they acknowledged that the insinuation carried moral weight. A missing couture piece is not a trivial claim in an industry built on trust, documentation, and reputation. Even without proof, the suggestion alone invites judgment. Supporters argued that Meghan was being punished by implication, subjected to a narrative that relied on status and stereotype rather than evidence. They pointed out that live television encourages drama and that designers like broadcasters understand the power of suggestion. Critics countered that Victoria Beckham would not risk her own credibility by raising the issue publicly unless private avenues had failed. Both positions gained traction because neither could be conclusively disproven. The fashion world watched closely. Several editors explained that couture houses rarely allow disputes to become public. When they do, it often signals a breakdown rather than a misunderstanding.
That
explanation implied history without confirming it. The story advanced not through revelation, but through inference. David Beckham's continued silence added another layer. Analysts debated whether the couple had deliberately let the remark stand. Some suggested that walking it back would undermine the original point. Others argued that silence protected them from escalation. Either way, the lack of clarification reinforced the sense that something unresolved sat beneath the surface. Online, the narrative hardened. Clips were reposted with increasingly definitive captions. What began as appears to suggest became called out. The $10,000 figure was repeated until it took on symbolic weight, representing not just a dress, but a perceived imbalance between rules and privilege. None of this established fact. All of it shaped belief. The antagonist structure was now fixed. On one side stood a designer representing industry discipline and personal boundary setting. On the other stood a duchess shielded by institutional distance and public silence. Between them stood the palace unwilling to arbitrate and a media ecosystem eager to interpret absence as meaning. As days passed, the question shifted again. It was no longer whether the dress existed or whether it had been returned. It was whether the unresolved implication would become part of Meghan's public narrative. Royal correspondents noted a familiar pattern. Stories that are never conclusively addressed tend to resurface later, referenced obliquely as context rather than headline. That long arc concerned palace advisors. They understood how reputational bleeding works. Even improving claims can attach themselves to identity if left unresolved. Future coverage would recall the incident as shorthand for controversy. Regardless of its factual basis, the cost is cumulative rather than immediate. Meghan's continued silence was read in competing ways. Supporters framed it as dignity, a refusal to engage in spectacle. Critics framed it as avoidance. In a media environment driven by reaction, silence rarely remains neutral. It becomes a canvas onto which audiences project motive. Victoria Beckham, meanwhile, did not elaborate. She did not repeat the claim. She did not retract it. The original remark stood alone, preserved in clips and transcripts. That restraint complicated the interpretation. It suggested confidence to some, caution to others. Again, the lack of clarification sustained debate rather than closing it. By the end of the week, headlines softened, but the residue remained. The story had matured from moment to memory. Editors acknowledged privately that even if the issue faded from daily coverage, it would remain searchable, referenced whenever discussions of celebrity entitlement or royal privilege resurfaced. The palace's strategy did not change. No statement was issued. No background briefing reframed the issue. The institution chose to preserve boundaries rather than reputations. That choice is consistent with precedent, but it carries consequences in an era where implication travels faster than denial. What this episode revealed was not the truth about a dress, but the mechanics of modern reputation. Live television collapses distance. Silence amplifies suggestion. And when institutions refuse to arbitrate, audiences step in to fill the gaps. In royal history, many controversies are resolved through documentation or apology. The ones that linger are those that remain undefined. This was one of those, not because of proof, but because of perception. No receipts were produced. No names were spoken again. Yet, the impact endured because the story aligned three powerful forces: celebrity, implication, and silence. Once aligned, they no longer require confirmation to persist. They simply wait, ready to resurface the next time scrutiny returns. In the modern monarchy, reputation can unravel without a single charge. Subscribe, like, and share for deeper investigations into celebrity power, royal silence, and the moments where implication does more damage than proof.